Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Welcome in, everyone, to another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling a topic that I think is really relevant to a lot of people listening, especially those of us who come from the Latter-day Saint tradition. It's this idea of spiritual self-reliance. You know, how do we balance trusting in authority with thinking for ourselves when it comes to spiritual matters?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It is.
For sure.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
And we've got a whole stack of sources here to kind of dig into. We've got talks, articles, even a podcast episode, all exploring this tension. But one thing that really stood out to me as I was going through these sources was this kind of consistent message from church leaders, discouraging deep dives into church history or anything outside of officially correlated material. Like, for example, Elder Renlund says, doubt has no value or worth.
That's a powerful statement.
It is. It's very strong.
And when you think about it from the perspective of someone who's wrestling with genuine questions,
Right.
it can almost feel like a silencing tactic, you know? Like,
Yeah.
Don't even go there. And I wonder if that could discourage individuals from seeking answers outside of the prescribed narrative and potentially hinder their spiritual growth.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really jumped out at me as I was reading through all this is how some church leaders seem to draw a distinction between what they call primary questions and secondary questions.
Yes, and several leaders have really emphasized this point.
Right.
You know, elders Irene, Corbridge, Renlund, they all kind of talk about this idea that we should be focusing on the primary questions.
Yeah.
The core beliefs about God's existence, Jesus Christ, Joseph Smith, the Restoration.
The foundational stuff.
All right, exactly.
Yeah, and the secondary questions like those thorny historical issues like polygamy and race and the priesthood, or even doctrinal questions about temple ordinances, that those shouldn't distract us from those core tenets of our faith.
Almost like they're saying, don't sweat the small stuff. Just focus on the big picture.
But for some people, those details feel really important.
Right.
You can't just ignore them or, brush them under the rug.
Absolutely. And that's where I think this tension between respecting authority and really exercising your own intellectual honesty, that's where that really comes into play.
Especially when you have some leaders who are suggesting that seeking answers outside of church-approved materials is dangerous or even faith-damaging.
It reminds me of that analogy that Elder Renlund uses about the rescued sailor who rejects a perfectly good lifeboat because of a few, minor imperfections. He's trying to illustrate that, focusing on those secondary questions, those imperfections, might lead someone to miss the overall value and safety of the church, which he's comparing to the lifeboat. But I think it's also interesting to look at that analogy in light of, the early history of the church, where investigation and seeking truth from all sorts of sources was really encouraged.
I love those quotes from like John Taylor where he says, we're not afraid of investigation.
Yes.
Or George A. Smith talking about how, if our religion can't stand up to scrutiny, then it's not worth much.
And Orson Pratt basically begging people to, correct him if they found any errors in, LDS doctrine.
It does feel like there was a different tone.
There was a real embrace of intellectual engagement.
So I guess the question is what shifted?
Yeah.
Why does there seem to be more of a caution, even a fear around, exploring different viewpoints now?
Well, I think, one possible explanation is that the church has grown so much, and with that growth comes, a greater need for uniformity and control, and may also a desire to protect members from information that might challenge their faith.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there have been some efforts to address some of those more difficult historical questions in recent years.
Like those gospel topics essays on the church's website.
Exactly. Those are a good example. They cover, controversial topics like polygamy, the Book of Abraham, race, and the priesthood.
But some critics would say that those essays still present a very carefully curated perspective that's aimed at reconciling those events with, the church's current narrative.
Yeah, and that's a fair point, I think.
Yeah.
And it really underscores the need for all of us to develop our own, independent truth-seeking skills.
So how do we do that? How do we balance, respecting authority and being intellectually honest, especially when it comes to our faith?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that even those we hold in high esteem, even our church leaders are still human. They can make mistakes. They don't have all the answers, and that's okay.
It doesn't diminish their role
Right.
or, our love for them, but it does mean that we need to approach their teachings with a discerning heart and a willingness to think for ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think that brings us to this BITE model that we wanted to talk about a little bit. It's a framework that was developed by Dr. Stephen Hassan,
Okay.
who specializes in cults and undue influence. And it stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotional control.
So it's really about how groups use different levers to influence their members.
Right. And it's a tool for evaluating the healthiness of influence within any group.
Any group.
Not just religious ones.
Okay.
It helps us identify potential red flags that might indicate there's an unhealthy level of control happening.
Yeah, and it seems particularly relevant to this conversation about spiritual self-reliance. If we're trying to avoid outsourcing our truth-seeking to authorities, we need to be aware of how manipulation and deception can operate even within a religious context.
For sure. So let's dive into that BITE model a little bit and see how it might apply to the LDS Church.
Okay.
One area where we see, potential information control is in the way that certain historical events are presented or in some cases omitted altogether.
Like the fact that, certain details about Joseph Smith's polygamy or the, historical context of the priesthood ban weren't widely known until fairly recently.
Right. And even now, those topics are often addressed in a way that kind of minimizes or downplays certain aspects of the story.
And then there's also that tendency to kind of label anything that challenges the church's narrative as anti-Mormon or unreliable.
Yeah, and that can be a form of thought control.
Yeah.
A way to shut down, critical thinking and discourage people from seeking out different perspectives.
It makes me think of that statement by Elder Packer about historians needing to only share the inspiring parts of truth.
Yes, that's a tricky one, because it raises some concerns about, potential historical manipulation. It's almost like saying we're only going to tell you the parts of the story that fit our narrative.
And what about emotional control? Think about all the emphasis on eternal families.
Right.
And that fear of being separated from loved ones in the afterlife if you're not, a faithful member of the church.
That's a powerful motivator for sure.
It is.
It can create a lot of anxiety and pressure to conform, even if you have, doubts or questions.
So are you saying that the Mormon Church is a cult?
Not necessarily. Remember, the BITE model is a spectrum, not a binary label.
Okay.
And I think it's important to remember that Dr. Hassan himself has said that while the LDS Church, exhibits some characteristics of a high control group, it's not as extreme as some other groups that he's studied.
So it's not about, slapping a label on the church one way or the other.
Right.
It's more about using this BITE model as a tool to help us think critically.
Exactly.
About, how information is presented and how influence is exerted.
And recognizing that even within a faith tradition that we love and respect, there can be elements that, warrant further scrutiny.
So if we're concerned about these potential red flags, how do we start developing those independent spiritual truth-seeking skills?
Yeah. Where do we go from here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. Well, it seems like Elder Corbridge offers some guidance in his BYU devotional. He suggests 4 methods for learning.
Okay.
Scientific, analytical, academic, and divine.
Okay. Those sound pretty comprehensive.
Right.
But are those methods inherently leading us to greater spiritual autonomy?
That's a good question.
Like, I'm wondering if there's a risk of bias creeping in, even with something like divine revelation, which should be,
divine.
Divine.
Right.
So we can't just assume that any warm, fuzzy feeling or profound thought we have is a direct message from God.
Not necessarily. It's about learning to discern those promptings and testing them against, the principles of truth, goodness, and love. Does this revelation lead me to a greater sense of compassion and understanding? Does it align with the teachings of Christ? Or does it reinforce my biases and prejudices? Those are questions we need to be asking ourselves.
It's like we need to develop a sort of spiritual filter,
Yeah.
a way of sifting through those experiences and messages to determine what aligns with our truest selves.
Exactly. And that's where the other learning methods that Corbridge mentions can come into play. Engaging in scientific inquiry, analyzing information critically,
Yeah.
and studying academic sources.
Yeah.
These can all help us broaden our perspectives and
Right.
challenge those preconceived notions that might be influencing our understanding.
So it's not about dismissing personal revelation altogether,
No.
but about recognizing its limitations
Yeah.
and seeking confirmation through other avenues of knowledge and being open to the possibility that our understanding of truth can evolve as we learn and grow.
Absolutely.
That reminds me of the example of Michael Brown from the Understanding Testimony source. He shared how he received this really powerful spiritual confirmation that solidified his belief in the church. But later, as he encountered information that challenged his beliefs, he began to question the nature and interpretation of that experience.
Michael's story is a great example of how our understanding of spiritual experiences can shift as we gain new knowledge and perspectives.
Yeah, it's not about denying the power or sincerity of those experiences, but about recognizing that they can be influenced by a variety of factors, both internal and external.
Exactly.
It makes me wonder how many of us are clinging to beliefs or interpretations because they're comfortable or familiar, even if they might not align with our current understanding of truth.
It's definitely not an easy process,
Right.
but it's an essential part of spiritual growth.
So where do we even begin? You know, if someone is feeling stuck, they're feeling that tension between what they're hearing from, church leaders and what their own intuition's telling them.
I think informed consent's a good place to start.
Okay.
Not just that initial, decision to be baptized,
Right.
but like an ongoing process of actively choosing your beliefs.
You not just kind of accepting what you've been taught, but really like examining it, researching it,
Yeah,
and deciding if it truly resonates with you.
exactly. And that means being willing to engage with information from a variety of sources, not just, those endorsed by the church.
So branching out beyond those, correlated materials, as they call them.
Precisely. Think of it like, getting a second opinion from a doctor. You trust your primary physician, but sometimes it's helpful to get another perspective,
Yeah.
especially if something doesn't feel quite right.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, too, about critical thinking skills, which is something we talked about earlier.
Yes, learning to evaluate information critically is crucial. Ask yourself, who's the author? What's their agenda? What evidence are they presenting? Are they considering alternative viewpoints?
So it's like we need to become savvy consumers of information, not just accepting everything we read or hear at face value.
Absolutely. And that applies to information from all sources,
Yeah.
not just church-related material.
Mhm.
I mean, we're bombarded with information constantly these days. So developing those critical thinking skills is essential.
And what about those like specific claims,
Mm-hmm.
that are made by the church? Like the historicity of the Book of Mormon or the translation of the Book of Abraham.
Yeah.
Like how do we approach those with this mindset of informed consent and critical thinking?
Well, that's where I think trusting experts in relevant fields can be incredibly helpful. So, if you're curious about the Book of Mormon's claims about ancient America, consult with archaeologists and geneticists.
Right.
For the Book of Abraham, Egyptologists can provide some really valuable insights.
So we're not just blindly trusting or rejecting, but we're actually doing some research
Right.
and talking to people who specialize in these areas.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, not passive in your pursuit of truth.
And I imagine that can be a pretty uncomfortable process,
Yeah.
especially for people who have maybe always relied on the church as their primary source of truth.
Absolutely. It can be unsettling to
Yeah.
question those long-held beliefs.
Sure.
But, doubt isn't the enemy of faith.
Mm.
In fact, it can be a real catalyst for growth.
It's like that saying, faith is a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes that journey takes us through some pretty rough terrain,
Yeah.
We might encounter information that challenges our assumptions, maybe even makes us angry or frustrated.
Sure.
But it's important to allow ourselves to feel those emotions and process them in a healthy way.
So it's okay to feel confused, even upset, as we're kind of grappling with these things.
Absolutely. It's totally normal. It's part of the human experience.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that you're not alone in this journey.
Hmm.
There are countless others who've wrestled with similar questions and come out the other side, with a stronger, more nuanced faith.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point because it's easy to feel isolated in this.
Right.
Like you're the only one who's struggling. But knowing that others have walked this path before can be so comforting and empowering.
And speaking of others who've wrestled with these questions, you mentioned that one of our sources is that podcast episode
Yes.
featuring Dr. Stephen Hassan.
Right. He actually spoke specifically about Mormonism and how this bite model might
Yeah.
apply.
And what were some of his key takeaways?
Well, he really emphasized that it's not about, labeling the church as a cult or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's about using the bite model as a tool
Yeah.
for self-reflection and critical thinking.
That makes sense. It's about, discerning whether certain aspects of the church's influence are healthy or potentially harmful.
Exactly. And he highlighted some specific areas that he thought, might warrant further scrutiny, like the emphasis on obedience,
Mm-hmm.
the black and white thinking that can sometimes, permeate the culture, and that fear of leaving the church.
Right. And those are all elements that we've kind of touched on in our conversation too, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
potential for thought control and emotional manipulation.
And it's not to say that those things are inherently bad, but it's about being aware of how they can be used in ways that might limit our agency or discourage us from thinking critically.
And it's about recognizing those patterns so that we can make informed choices about how we want to engage
Yeah.
with our faith.
So how does someone know if they're being manipulated or deceived? What are some of those red flags to watch out for?
Well, I think one key indicator is a lack of transparency,
Okay.
If information is being withheld or distorted, that's a cause for concern.
Like if you ask questions about, church history or doctrine and you're met with dismissive answers
Right.
or told to just trust the brethren.
Exactly. Or if you're told that, seeking information from outside sources is dangerous or will lead you astray.
Mhm. Another red flag might be an overemphasis on obedience and submission to authority.
Yes, if questioning or dissenting opinions are discouraged or even punished,
Yeah.
that's a sign of an unhealthy power dynamic.
And what about emotional manipulation? How do we recognize that?
That can be a little bit trickier, but it often involves playing on people's fears and insecurities.
Like the fear of losing your family or your eternal salvation if you leave the church.
Exactly. Or feeling like you're a bad person if you have doubts or questions.
It sounds like a lot of this comes down to trusting your own intuition.
Yeah.
If something feels off,
Mm-hmm.
even if everyone around you is telling you it's okay,
Right.
it's worth paying attention to that feeling.
Absolutely. Your inner compass.
Yeah.
Is a powerful tool. And if you're feeling that dissonance, that tension
Mhm.
between what you're being told and what your gut is telling you,
Right.
it's a sign that you need to do some more exploring.
But what if you're afraid to explore?
Mm.
What if you're scared of where those questions might lead?
That's understandable.
Yeah.
It can be scary to step outside of your comfort zone,
Right.
especially when it comes to something as deeply personal as your faith.
And let's be honest, there can be real social consequences
Yeah.
for questioning or leaving the church.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. You might lose friends. Family members might distance themselves. You might face ostracism from your community.
That's a very real concern, and it's one that we shouldn't minimize, but it's also important to remember that your mental and emotional well-being
Yeah.
are paramount.
So if staying in the church is causing you more harm than good,
Mm-hmm.
if it's leading to anxiety, depression,
Yeah.
a sense of spiritual disconnect, it might be time to reevaluate your relationship with the institution.
And that might mean stepping away, at least for a time, to create space for healing and self-discovery.
And if you choose to do that, it's important to remember that you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
There are support groups, there are therapists who specialize in religious trauma.
Yes.
There are online communities where you can connect with others who have been through similar experiences.
It can be incredibly validating and empowering to share your story with others who understand
Yeah.
what you're going through.
And even if you choose to remain in the church, it's still possible to develop that spiritual self-reliance that we've been talking about.
Absolutely.
It's about being an active participant in your faith, not just passively absorbing what you're told.
It's about, engaging with the scriptures, asking tough questions, seeking out diverse perspectives,
Yeah.
and nurturing your own personal connection with the divine.
So whether you choose to stay or to go, to believe or to doubt, The most important thing is that you're making conscious choices
Mm.
that are aligned with your values and your own personal truth.
Beautifully said. And it's a journey that requires ongoing reflection,
Yeah.
introspection, and a willingness to evolve.
And sometimes that evolution leads to, unexpected and even uncomfortable places.
That's right. But as we learn to embrace that uncertainty and trust our own inner compass,
Hmm.
we open ourselves to the possibility of a deeper, more authentic, and ultimately more fulfilling spiritual life.
It really is a journey, isn't it? With like
Yeah.
no set destination, it's more of an ongoing exploration.
Mm.
And as we wrap up our deep dive into spiritual self-reliance, one thing that keeps coming back to me is this idea of big faith. One of our
Mm.
sources talked about that, of faith that's strong enough to hold both like certainty and uncertainty at the same time.
Yeah, that's such a powerful concept because it allows for nuance, for
Oh.
questioning, for doubt even, without like undermining the core of your belief system.
Exactly.
Right.
Acknowledging that, we don't have all the answers. And that's okay.
Right.
It's actually in those spaces of uncertainty that I think real growth can occur.
That's where curiosity and critical thinking can really thrive. That's where we start to develop that more personal, more authentic relationship with the divine that's untethered from like rigid dogma or blind obedience.
It's interesting because, we've been talking about the potential pitfalls of outsourcing our truth-seeking to authority figures, but we've also talked about the importance of trusting experts.
Hmm.
So how do we reconcile those two seemingly contradictory ideas?
That's a great question. And I think the key is recognizing that there's a difference between blindly accepting authority and seeking out, informed perspectives.
Okay.
When we consult experts, we're not abdicating our responsibility to think critically.
Right.
We're engaging with their knowledge, their research, their experience to kind of broaden our own understanding.
So we're using their expertise as a tool to
Exactly.
help us make more informed decisions.
As a tool, not as a substitute for our own discernment.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, trust but verify. We can respect the expertise of others, but we're still engaging our own, critical faculties.
Exactly. And when it comes to spiritual matters, that might involve, seeking out diverse perspectives from theologians, philosophers, religious scholars, even people from different faith traditions.
So expanding our horizons, challenging our assumptions, recognizing that truth can be found in some pretty unexpected places.
Absolutely. And sometimes the most profound truths are the ones that we discover through our own personal experiences,
Yeah.
our own wrestling with questions, our own moments of spiritual insight.
Those aha moments
Yes.
kind of come when you least expect them.
Exactly. And those often arise when we're willing to be open-minded, to
Yeah.
step outside of our comfort zones,
Yeah.
and to really listen to that inner voice that's guiding us towards truth.
That inner compass that we were talking about earlier.
Yes. And that
Yeah.
compass, it might lead us in directions that challenge the status quo,
Mhm.
that make other people uncomfortable, even lead to, conflict or disagreement. But it's in those moments of discomfort, those moments of wrestling with complexity, that we truly grow and evolve.
And that's where the courage comes in, isn't it?
Yes.
The courage to be true to ourselves, even when it's difficult or unpopular.
Absolutely. And that courage, that willingness to stand firm in your convictions, that's ultimately what leads to a more authentic and fulfilling spiritual life.
One that's not dictated by, external pressures or fear of judgment, but by that deep inner knowing, that sense of alignment with our own unique truth.
Well said.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
If you had the opportunity to ask God one question to clarify your spiritual path, what would it be? And how would you approach finding the answer?
That's a good one.
Yeah, something for all of us to kind of ponder as we continue on our own unique journeys.
Right.
And until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.